Hey, Michael, how's it going?
I'm doing real well. How are you doing, Blake?
I'm good. How's the weather up there in Boston?
It's about 15 degrees outside, so a little chilly, but one of the advantages of being a vlogger, I guess, is you never really have to leave your house.
Are you at home?
I am at home.
Oh, I'm so jealous. I had to come into the office today, Martin Luther King Day.
That's unfortunate. So, your office is at Foreign Policy. Why don't you do your introduction first here?
Yeah, I'm the online editor of Foreign Policy magazine, which is a bi-monthly in Washington. I'm not speaking on behalf of Foreign Policy today. I just want to make that clear, even though we're doing a little branding here in the background.
I unfortunately can't see you, but I am the online editor of the Weekly Standard. I think I'll make the same caveat here that I do not speak on behalf of the Weekly Standard. But
you
yes,
speak on behalf of all conservatives in America, right?
Or at least neoconservatives.
Right.
What should we get started here with?
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about North Korea? There's a lot going on recently with the North Koreans not meeting the deadline to declare all of their nuclear programs. A lot of talk, chatter in Washington about whether this deal with North Korea, the six-party framework deal, is leading us down a path to disaster or not. I'm sure you've got some views on it.
Yeah, no, I don't know if you saw the editorial in the Wall Street Journal this morning, which basically sort of sides with Jay Lefkowitz, who is the president's point man on human rights in North Korea, and who sort of broke ranks with the State Department last week to give this speech at AEI that was very critical of the six-party talks, very critical of sort of our gullibility in dealing with the North Koreans. And I guess the Journal sort of was optimistic that perhaps Lefkowitz was not just speaking for himself, but was speaking for the president as sort of his personal appointee.
It's funny because, as of December, people were saying, who is this guy, Lefkowitz? We never heard a peep out of him. So all of a sudden now he's, front page.
Well, you should be reading the Weekly Standard. He, I believe, has written several times for the Weekly Standard. But no, Lefkowitz, I think, is one of his points here is that all this aid we're giving them is sort of going directly toward the military and the elite, and further that really the Chinese are not being helpful here, that the North Koreans have no intention of disarming, and that we really have no way of verifying anything they say.
Well, I think the good news is that the plutonium plant at Yongbyon has been, being dismantled. Things might be on hold a little bit right now, but the good news is, they're no longer pumping out plutonium there. So I don't think it's a complete wash. I think we have to put things in perspective and be a little patient with the North Koreans. You might have noticed that since the deal really got underway last February, there hasn't been a lot of news about North Korea. They haven't seemed as scary, and there's a reason for that. It's because we're in this negotiating process. It's ugly. The North Koreans are a tough negotiating partner. They play games all the time, but I think it's for the best. And I think that the people that are really worried about the deal and trying to take a different road are really missing the point, which is to get the plutonium out of production.
Okay, well, there is some truth to what you say that things have sort of seemed relatively quiet from North Korea, but of course the one major incident was this the Israeli bombing of that unidentified suspected reactor in Syria, which I saw John Bolton gave an interview to Haaretz that I just posted on, and one of the things he said in that interview was that we are, the American people are owed a full accounting of what exactly that building was. And since suspicions rest with the North Koreans, you wonder whether maybe they're not up to no good, sort of while we're not, in other places.
Well, there's it's interesting that you mentioned that because I don't know if you're familiar with David Albright's group, ISIS. They basically published some new photos, I think last week,
Yeah, the Monopoly House, right?
Yeah, it looks like a big blue Monopoly house. And so the Syrians have actually rebuilt a building that's a little bit larger. Now it's 60 feet square instead of 43 feet square. Now it's got a peaked roof instead of a flat roof. I mean, nobody really knows what the building is, but if it's a nuclear facility, then that was a pretty quick turnaround. So I think the speculation now is that maybe it was some sort of weapons-related facility, a warehouse, but it's doubtful that it was a nuclear facility. But again, I don't know. I'm not dialed into the intelligence. I have to admit, I was pretty skeptical when that Israeli raid happened. And then, then those photos came out of the site being swept clean, and that looked very suspicious. And Syria hasn't let the IAEA inspectors in. So, there are a lot of open questions about that. There was an article.
It's very suspicious. I mean, you don't want to trust these people inherently, and then you'd figure anytime the Israelis go bomb something, right? What are they going to do? They're going to drag the cameras in, and whether it really happened that way or not, they're going to make it out to be some sort of pharmaceutical company that's sending aspirin to Gaza.
Right.
And of course, here's the one instance where that's not what they do at all. They sweep the place up. They don't let any media in. They don't let any inspectors in. And before you know it, they've built another building on the site. It's deeply suspicious.
Well, I'm sure it was that the new building they built is some kind of orphanage or something, and but the funny thing is that the United States and the Israelis were also very quiet about the bombing back in September, and there was a lot of speculation that the reason that everyone was so quiet is that they didn't want to jeopardize the deal with North Korea. They didn't want conservative, opposition in Congress to have a chance to stir up. So if the U.S. had really pressed for the IAEA to send in inspectors and to look and see if whether there was any nuclear residue or material there, that would have cast questions on the North Korea deal that the administration, which wanted it to continue and I think still wants it to go on, they didn't want to have raised.
No, and of course the North Koreans also inserted themselves into the thing bizarrely. There were all types of official news releases, denials, etc., out of the North Korean state media. So the whole thing is very suspicious. I certainly think it would be foolish to assume that they are not currently proliferating. I actually think Lefkowitz is exactly right that they are such egregious human rights offenders that the current process, it doesn't make a lot of sense to sort of go forward and assume that, the North Koreans are going to continue with their disablement, whatever that's supposed to mean. No, I think it's actually time for the administration to get a little tougher and sort of, there's always been this perception on the right that this deal was profoundly Clintonian, that this was sort of a rehash of what we'd already tried and failed in the 90s.
So what do we go back to? Like the last 7 years where we got nothing, where we were just hoping that the regime would fall and that suddenly that we'd get control of those nuclear weapons. I think that's really irresponsible, and we're right now it's not an ideal situation. I don't think anybody is going into this with rose-colored glasses about the North Korean regime. But the fact is that we've gone in there. The U.S. Inspectors have been at Yongbyon dismantling it. We don't know how much plutonium they actually produced. They said they produced something like 30 kilograms, and there are questions about whether they produced 60 kilograms. But the bottom line is that's better than sitting on the outside pissing into the wind. So I really disagree with you here about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've sort of propped up this regime for a very long time by delivering food aid, by delivering fuel. I think actually we would be much better served if we sort of stopped doing that and let nature take its course there. And of course you can say that's sort of cold and you're going to have millions of people starving. Well, I suspect those people are starving anyway. That most of this aid that we give does not get to those people. And really, you couldn't have a worse situation than the status quo in North Korea. There's really nothing at all that could possibly be worse. Basically, you have an entire country that has been turned into a concentration camp. So, to my mind, it's like anything would be better than what we're doing right now.
So, I mean, so let's say that the North Korean regime somehow collapses, then what do you envision? What's happening there?
Well, it would be a mess. It would certainly be a mess for the Chinese. It's hard to imagine those people streaming south through the demilitarized zone. I'm sure there are a bunch of guys somewhere in South Korea who have spent a lot of time thinking about that. It's probably a huge inconvenience for the Chinese and the South Koreans, but that really shouldn't be our primary concern. I think, Lefkowitz identifies the primary concern. Our concern should be the human rights of people in North Korea and the threat to security that the North Korean regime presents. Beyond that, this is a problem for the South Koreans, the Chinese, and us to resolve in some kind of favorable way when the situation breaks.
I think that, there are definitely situations that could be worse than the present one. I mean, I think you could have massive refugee flows out of North Korea into China, creating chaos, thousands of people, dying. And
how could that be worse than the present situation? I mean, they would be leaving China because what they're leaving behind is worse. I mean, whatever they found in China would be an improvement. So you have some type of major Red Cross type operation. I don't know. There'd be some kind of international movement to help out. I'm just saying there couldn't possibly be anything worse than the status quo.
Well, there's been some speculation that the Chinese have actually started to worry about this, and that they're kind of preparing an endgame in the event of a North Korean collapse. Did you get a chance to read the article in Military Review?
No, I didn't. I got to scan that briefly, but why don't you tell us about it here?
Well, basically, it's this article that it's hard to know how well sourced it is. It's this article in Military Review. Guy by the name of Captain Jonathan Stafford, U.S. Army. I think he's based in Australia. And he says basically that the Chinese have been preparing for North Korea's collapse. They've got this project called the Northeast Asia Project. Chinese, of course, deny this, but the Chinese have basically been deploying more soldiers on the border with North Korea. They have been laying kind of a cultural groundwork, according to Stafford. He says that they've been trying to turn the history of that area into more of a Chinese Han cultural heritage. And so, the speculation in the article is that, China is getting ready for an inevitable North Korean collapse, or maybe they're just being prepared. And Stafford, the author, is sort of worried about the prospect of China being able to take over North Korea if North Korea falls.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said before, it's hard to imagine how that would be worse than the status quo. You're not giving the Chinese some type of vast expanse of territory. If that were the case, I would think that eventually, I think Korean reunification is in the offing at some point, whether it takes another 50 years or 100. I just don't see North Korea becoming a province of China ultimately, and I don't see what they would have to gain from that except for sort of stabilizing the region. And again, I don't think Chinese control of North Korea could possibly be any worse than the status quo.
Well, don't you think that the United States would rather see a unified Korea than having the Chinese military be right up against the South Korean border there? I mean, they could set up all kinds of listening posts, and they could get a lot better intelligence on U.S. forces based in South Korea. The Chinese certainly don't want a unified Korea that could turn into an economic powerhouse someday down the road. China probably wants a few more ports along North Korea's east coast. So, I think if you're playing the strategic chessboard kind of game, then you'd have to rather see a unified Korea down the road than a Chinese puppet state or like a Tibet scenario where North Korea gets incorporated.
I don't disagree at all. I don't think that would be an ideal outcome by any stretch. I just again would return to sort of the core position here, which is that the status quo is awful, and we should be doing whatever we can to try and sort of rattle things. It's always dangerous to say things couldn't get any worse, But I'm sort of, that's sort of what you're left with looking at North Korea. Is it's hard to imagine a situation where things could get any worse. You have a regime that's testing nuclear weapons. You have a regime that's imprisoned a huge portion of its population. You have famine. It's just a total disaster.
Well, let's move on. We got a lot of other topics that I think we want to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Missile defense, I know, is a big topic of yours. So why don't you kick that off here?
Well, sure. Missile defense seems to be quickly sort of evolving here, at least on the political front. We've seen a lot of movement recently. We see two things in particular. We see the Czechs and the Poles negotiating the terms of allowing some type of missile defense facilities on their territory. In the case of the Czechs, a radar, and in the case of the Poles, ballistic interceptors. And you're sort of watching the bargaining process right now, which at times looks a bit like extortion. You have populations in both those countries that are not terribly well disposed toward missile defense, and yet you have governments that seem willing to negotiate, but they just want to get the best terms possible.
Is the sense that they want to feel like they got a fair deal, or at least even got the upper hand in the deal, so that they can go to their own populations and say, yeah, we know you don't like these missile defense facilities, but hey, we stuck it to those Americans, and look at all the F-16s or whatever we got.
No, I think that's sort of precisely what we're seeing, right? Is this is for one, I think they do want to see, they want to maximize their gains out of this and sort of assure their security out of this. And that's one of the things that the Poles at least are asking for is explicit security guarantees, which I think the administration seems inclined to give. They also want a more sophisticated air defense system, which would include surface-to-air missiles, missile interceptors like the Patriot, and also F-16s. And not only do they want these things, they want the United States to give them to them for free.
Yeah. Which is a big problem for the U.S., because then all of a sudden everyone else is saying, hey, look what Poland got. Why can't we get free Patriot missiles and F-16s, right?
No, it's deeply problematic. And a fella named Reuben Johnson wrote a piece for our website, which is still up there. People can check it out, about the damage that this is going to do to the Polish defense industry, which is actually quite vibrant. And so what we're going to see there is you have a defense industry that's actually quite capable of making surface-to-air missiles. Was sort of the cream of the Soviet defense industry in Poland, and has fared pretty well over the last 10, 15 years. And all of a sudden, the government is negotiating for all these free, advanced Western systems, which they could probably get something, a very close approximation at home if they were willing to pay for it. So you see tremendous damage being done to the Polish defense industry out of this. And you see the U.S. government appears pretty willing to comply, as they've done in the past when they provided a loan for F-16s to the Poles, and no one's clamoring for that loan to be repaid. For short-term gain to try and move this missile defense process along, it looks like we are going to pay a price down the road. But these are the sort of the considerations that people are dealing with. The Czechs actually are much more being a bit more reasonable about all this, and they just want a share of the business. They want to be involved in constructing this radar. They want to benefit from the science and technology of it and have their people involved.
But if I were the Czechs and the Poles, I'd be looking at President Bush leaving office at the beginning of 2009 and thinking, this missile defense is, assuming that a Democrat wins, as seems likely, missile defense is going to be one of the first things to go. Don't you think that?
I think that's a possibility. I mean, it's certainly we're a long way from November. The Poles are sort of slow playing the whole thing. I think that's part of their calculation. But if you're the Poles and you think you can get all this stuff for free under Bush, I'm not sure you wouldn't try and consolidate your gains right now.
That's true.
But yeah, I mean, it's would a Hillary Clinton be as likely to sort of bring an end to missile defense as an Obama? I'm not sure. I think it's probably unlikely. I mean, Bill Clinton had plenty of time to kill missile defense, and he didn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like it's like the beast that never dies. It never seems to be working exactly the way we want it to, but it keeps churning forward.
Well, they have a very impressive record recently. I spoke with Obring, who's the head of the Missile Defense Agency, late in the fall.
Let me guess. He says that it works well.
He said it's a spectacular system, that we have missile defense right now. But they've racked up a pretty impressive score. People take the numbers and say, oh, well, this is, if you had to grade it, they'd be a B- because they're, I think maybe, like 33 for 39 or some such. I don't remember the number of successful tests off the top of my head. No, they've been very consistent lately. They've had a lot of successes lately. And I think there's reason to believe that this system's on the right track, although some of the more promising systems are on the cutting floor right now. The airborne laser is in real jeopardy, and that program's been pretty desperate to secure the funds it needs to continue. There's definitely...
Backing up for a second, though, I mean, who is really the threat when you're talking about missile defense in Eastern Europe? I mean, the Russians, seem adamant that it's designed to work against their interests. The U.S. says no. These missile defense installations are geared against Iran. Iran doesn't even have nuclear weapons. If anything, they're maybe 3 to 8 years away. So I still don't understand, given all the problems it has caused diplomatically, getting the Russians on board with sanctions against Iran, how it's even worth it at this point. Because, okay, let's say even if the technology works beautifully, which I tend to doubt, where's the real threat we're talking about?
Well, I think what it does ultimately is, of course, the Iranians right now cannot affix a nuclear warhead to an intercontinental ballistic missile on.
Well, they don't have a nuclear warhead.
They don't have a nuclear warhead, and they don't have a missile that could reach.
They might not even have a nuclear program. I mean, we can get into that. That's another.
That's another topic. But I think what missile defense is, yes, the technology is not right now, fully operational, but there's a real chance that it would be. There's a little
Star Wars reference in there.
I think what it does, though, is it gives you another option, right? I mean, if everyone has sort of decided that a nuclear Iran would be intolerable, right? I mean, there's very little, there's a majority of Americans find this to be an intolerable proposition, and even among the Democrats, I mean, it's not really, they're not having an argument about what to do when Iran goes nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, no politician is going to say it's okay.
Right, so what you have is missile defense would give you a new option. It would give you the option to say, okay, well, if Iran does go nuclear, we have this fallback where we can feel sort of relatively secure that we might be able to shoot one. I mean, it's not the position I would like to be in. I would find that an unpalatable, policy position for some Democratic president to say, well, we have missile defense, so let's not worry about it. But I would think from a Democrat's perspective that this would be actually a really good thing. That it would say, okay, well, now we don't need to preemptively go in there and take out a nuclear program because we have a fallback position that we didn't have before.
Well, isn't part of it really psychological? I mean, I took game theory in college, but it's been a while. But let's say even if missile defense doesn't work as perfectly as we would like, the Iranians might, it introduces a lot of doubt in the Iranians' minds. Down the road, someday, when, if possible, they have nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. But let's say that they did, and there's missile defense. We don't know whether it works or not, or maybe we secretly know that it doesn't work quite as well as we'd like. The Iranians, there's enough doubt in their minds that they might think twice, 3 times, 4 times about tangling with us.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's never going to be, I would never, as many times as they test this thing, I would never feel comfortable with the idea that, okay, we're not going to worry about somebody launching a nuclear missile at us because we have missile defense. I mean, even if it was a 1 in 100 chance that the thing doesn't work, I mean, that would be too much of a risk, right? But it's a technology that I think is really promising, and you've sort of seen it with the development of THAAD and the Patriot missile. This is something that we're getting better able to do. All of a sudden, the prospect of shooting missiles out of the sky has become, very, very realistic. And so I would think it would be foolish not to pursue that kind of technology. It could be useful on the battlefield, and it can be useful in a strategic sense.
But there's a difference, right, between pursuing the technology and deploying it in Eastern Europe and getting the Russians all riled up. Because what I worry about is that, we all want to make sure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. And I worry that by alienating the Russians and getting their hackles up with the missile defense program in Eastern Europe, that we're missing a chance to tighten the noose, the economic sanctions on Iran at the Security Council. The Russians have basically made it clear that they're not on board, in part because of their problems with the missile defense program in Eastern Europe. Now we certainly don't know. Okay, if there were no missile defense program going on in Eastern Europe, the Russians might still have very good reasons for wanting to take a different tack on Iran. And of course, the Chinese, they've said all along, we prefer a diplomatic approach, quiet negotiations, what have you. And who knows? The Russians and the Chinese might look at a nuclear Iran as, or at least an Iran that's causing diplomatic problems for the United States as kind of a help. They're not necessarily looking out for U.S. interests.
Yeah, no, I think precisely. It's hard to know. You take missile defense off the table, which is sort of been a major American security initiative for 25 years, and we've actually made tremendous progress at it. And you take that off the table, and then what? Then the Russians find another reason to stall and delay, and then you've taken away one further option for dealing with Iran when it does acquire these kind of technologies. I just think that would be a horribly short-sighted thing to do. But I don't know. Should we jump on to some of this other stuff? I feel like we're getting bogged down in this. Should we move on to?
Yeah, sure.
What do you want to do? Iraq or?
Yeah, let's talk about Iraq for a little bit because I've kind of been interested in. I know that you guys are big fans of McCain over there. And,
we haven't endorsed anyone. There's no official endorsement at the Weekly Standard.
No, I know. But it's no secret that the situation in Iraq is a lot better now than it was a year ago when the surge was announced. And for a while there, it looked like McCain was dead in the water. He was the guy that was very pro-surge. He'd been beating up on Donald Rumsfeld for a long time, and then finally it looked like getting rid of Donald Rumsfeld was who advocated kind of the light footprint approach. Getting rid of Donald Rumsfeld sort of unlocked the door for the surge to happen, and McCain really tied his political fortunes to that, and now it looks like a smart move, whereas in the summer it looked like a real disaster for him.
Well, not to take anything away from McCain, but I think this was sort of a ploy on his part in the sense that he constantly kept saying, I'd rather win the war than win an election. And he said, I've supported this and I'm willing to pay sort of any price for my support of the surge, for my support of the war. I think that was sort of, that all obscured the fact that the reason conservatives turned on him had nothing to do with the war. It was entirely about immigration. And the fact that the surge worked out, beyond anyone's expectations, of course McCain benefited from that tremendously, but it was never the fact that Iraq was going so poorly at the time that caused his campaign to sort of implode. It was the fact that he backed, an immigration bill with Ted Kennedy, which was, completely anathema to your sort of average movement conservative.
Well, isn't it also, too, that the rest of the Republican field they all have these sort of fatal flaws? Like, for instance, Romney, let's be frank here, a lot of evangelicals and other Americans are uncomfortable with the idea of a Mormon president. And then you've got, Fred Thompson's never really caught fire. He doesn't even seem to get out of bed in the morning anymore. And then
that was a pretty pathetic speech he gave the other night.
I mean, the guy just doesn't seem to have any interest in actually being president. It probably was a bad career move for him. He had that Law and Order gig. That
he could end up on the ticket. I would think. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility.
Really, you don't think that having such a bad run really makes him look bad?
He's still a real darling for sort of your average conservative blogger is still pretty smitten with Fred.
Mm-hmm.
I would think that, especially for a guy like McCain who has so much trouble with sort of the party's base, that a Thompson as a running mate would be a real boon to sort of his ability to consolidate his support within the party.
So what would he say? Like, Fred Thompson, he's convinced me that my previous ideas about immigration were all wrong, and...
Well, McCain sort of tried to make amends on that stuff, and he has tried to sort of... he said, look, I understand. I saw him up in New Hampshire in the fall. I went up there and watched him, and he kept saying, look, I got the message. It's about securing the border first. So he has tried to sort of, make amends with the people he'd alienated with that bill. And I think he's been fairly effective at that. I think if he hadn't sort of convinced people that was a priority for him, that we wouldn't have seen him win in New Hampshire. We wouldn't have seen him win in South Carolina. I think it would be... as divided as the field is, I think it would be a mistake to assume that all this is because the surge went well. I think part of it is because he was able to sort of repair some of the damage he'd done to his own campaign there.
So you think McCain now is sort of on the path to win the nomination?
Well, I see the Drudge has flashed a Rasmussen poll that shows Romney ahead in Florida, which means
Rudy's done.
Yeah, I think Rudy's done for sure. But you never know until the votes are cast. But I think he's facing a real uphill battle now. I think McCain has the clearest path to the nomination now. I mean, Romney, I think it's essentially a two-man race now, Romney versus McCain. Romney has the money to go to the distance. This is all fairly conventional wisdom, but I would think McCain would have a real shot in places like California and New York and, sort of delegate-rich states where his type of moderate conservatism plays well. His environmental stands, which are somewhat controversial within the party, may play really well in a state like California. So,
it's funny, like thinking about now the general election. We were talking about the surge in Iraq earlier. It seems like a lot of Americans, if not the majority of Americans, have basically ignored what's happened over the past year. And first of all, I don't want to credit the surge with everything that's happened in Iraq. A lot of it has been just being smart and picking up on what was already happening in Anbar province. But in any case, Americans have kind of decided a long time ago that Iraq is all screwed up and that they don't want to be there anymore. So even as it seems like the U.S. has kind of gotten a little extra lease on life there, the American people are already set on withdrawal no matter what seems to be happening.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I've seen some polls recently that show sort of for the first time a plurality of Americans for the first time in a long time think that things are moving in the right direction in Iraq, that we're making progress, and I think sort of the key thing, of course, is keeping casualties on sort of a downward trend, which it looks like this month will reverse that trend for the first time in a long time, but only very marginally. So I think if they're able to keep casualties low, I don't see why patients should run out too quickly.
So when McCain was in New Hampshire and he answered that question about Iraq, and he said, we could be there for 100 years or 1,000,000 years as long as American troops aren't dying in large numbers. Do you think that that the American people will buy that? Because I look at the campaign and the general campaign, I think Democratic candidate, whoever it is, Obama, Hillary, they're going to use that kind of stuff against him.
I think that's part of McCain's charm, right? Is that he's a straight talker and he's not afraid to say what he's thinking. I think he's actually right. I mean, look, you still have American troops in Korea. You still have American troops in Germany and Japan. I'm not convinced that, if you were able to really stabilize the situation and reduce the violence, that you'd have huge resistance to a sort of permanent or semi-permanent, American bases there. And we saw recently, one of the Iraqi ministers come out and say that they would not be able to secure their borders to sort of be responsible for their national security until 2018 at the earliest. That would seem even optimistic to me. With Iran on its border, there's going to be a need for American air power there for, well into the foreseeable future.
Yeah, right now they've got some basically paper airplanes and a few helicopters, I think.
Yeah, they have some prop airplanes. There is talk about sort of standing up the Iraqi Air Force, but, there's no way that's going to be a competent branch of the Iraqi military within the next 10 years. So, you're going to need American power there for a long time. The key is that, you're not seeing the kind of daily violence that we have now, and so that's the goal.
I mean, I think it's even possible that, let's say Hillary Clinton is the Democratic nominee and she becomes president. I think that there could be U.S. troops in Iraq throughout her first term. I mean, she's sort of hedged a little bit, but basically she's come out in favor of withdrawal. And, who's to say that she gets into office, January 2009 and doesn't decide, well, wait a minute, maybe we really ought to be there for the long haul.
No, I
agree.
But
that's gonna cause a lot of problems in her base.
No, I agree, and she's sort of tacked left when as soon as Obama became a real serious threat, she tacked left. But it was interesting. We saw David Brooks on the NewsHour. I think it was yesterday. I saw the YouTube yesterday anyway, in which he said that the Bush administration feels like Hillary would be a much better candidate for president than Obama. That she would be more likely to sort of consolidate the legacy of the Bush administration in Iraq than Obama would. That she would be more likely to sort of come at this seriously and not just sort of push for an immediate withdrawal. And I think there's something to that.
Well, I actually think more broadly. Whoever the next president is, everyone's been, talking about change, and that seems to be the message on both sides of the aisle. But, the Bush administration isn't the same Bush administration that it was in 2001. I mean, they've moved a lot more in a realist, internationalist direction. We've already talked about North Korea, but, they've been much more friendly with European allies. Seem much more willing to go in a multilateral direction. And so, whoever the next president is, there's really not, unless they do something radically different, I really don't anticipate their foreign policy being that different.
I think they're also likely to get a lot more help from the international community. I mean, there's such a there's such a problem with Bush in Europe and
but it's also an excuse, I mean, Grant, he did a lot of things to piss the Europeans off in his first term, but now it's a very convenient thing because cooperating with the United States on a lot of issues is going to be unpopular in Europe, and the governments there will do it anyway out of their own interest. So now it's a really convenient excuse to point the finger at Bush whenever they don't want to do something. And they're not going to have that excuse anymore. Yeah, no,
I think that's certainly one of the things to sort of look forward to after Bush leaves office is you sort of imagine that the Europeans will be much more cooperative on a whole range of issues, which is really sort of sad that's sort of what's preventing them from being productive partners in Iraq and in dealing with Iran. But you sort of imagine that this is a huge part of it. Is just the animosity towards Bush amongst people in Europe.
But when we're talking about sort of concrete help from the Europeans, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Even Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, said recently that basically they haven't gotten the help they needed in Afghanistan, and he pretty much hinted that the Europeans really dropped the ball there.
So, no, I mean, right. You'd like to see them come around a bit on sanctions and these types of things for Iran to be more helpful in that kind of the diplomatic track, and I think they would be in a different administration. But militarily, I mean, these are profoundly weak states. They really don't have, Gates needs 7,500 more troops for Afghanistan, and they are not forthcoming. The Czechs offered 400 more troops, I saw, but by and large, you're even the French announced that they're going to set up a military base in the Gulf, and it looks like at most there might be 1,000 French military personnel
I look
there.
at that and I think that's just a way for the French to, it's sort of like a showroom for their aircraft to sell to Gulf monarchs.
I think there's
military.
I remember reading something in Jane's about a year ago that the new French Rafale fighter, they'd sort of set it up with this new package for to be able to deliver a strike capability, and then they'd sent these Rafale fighters over to Afghanistan, and they started bombing people, and of course they weren't doing this out of any sense of alliance with the United States or to be more helpful in Afghanistan. What they wanted to do is showcase the abilities of their new fighters so they could sell it overseas.
The ridiculous thing about it is these Gulf monarchs, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, that buy up a lot of these platforms. They're never really going to use them. They just they just like having them. It seems like, and they say, I guess the worry is Iran is going to cause problems, but I really don't see the Iranians actually getting involved in the UAE or Saudi Arabia. So the whole thing is kind of a joke, I think.
Well, they all have these Shiite populations, and we've seen it already in Yemen, where there have been allegations that Iran is sort of fostering separatism amongst these Shiite groups there.
But it doesn't have anything to do with fighter planes.
Well, I mean, I think they have reason to be concerned about Iran. If I was one of these guys in Saudi Arabia, and you have all this money floating around, and sort of this has always been one of the understandings is that the West buys all this oil and they turn around and spend a lot of the money on weapons. I think it's totally understandable that they would want to sort of secure enough defense equipment to protect themselves from a aggressive Iranian regime.
But I think it's really convenient, though, a lot of times when there are Shiite populations, like in eastern Saudi Arabia. Bahrain is majority Shiites, home to the Fifth Fleet, the United States Fifth Fleet. And periodically there are political flare-ups, and then the governments, which are Sunni, they point the finger to Iran and say Iran is stirring up all these Shiites, and they're sort of painting these Shiite populations as like tools of a foreign power. So who knows really how much Iran is actually causing trouble or not? Because it's very convenient for a government like Saudi Arabia, which let's be frank, is pretty much one of the most repressive governments out there. It's really convenient for them to point the finger at Iran. So, I mean, I really wouldn't put it past the Iranians. Certainly in the past, they've caused trouble in Bahrain, stirred up the Shiite population. But we have to look at some of these claims with a little bit of skepticism.
Well, look, I mean, there are a lot of things going on with these weapon sales. I mean, we saw with the Eurofighter deal in Saudi Arabia, the Saudis had been working on a deal to buy, I think it was 72 Eurofighters for practically 20 years, and it was discovered there was all types of corruption involved in this.
Oh yeah, you get the kickbacks on the deal.
The kickbacks, and it's these things are happening on a lot of levels. These are deals to sort of secure relationships, and it's a very murky world, and I wouldn't deny that at all.
Mm-hmm. One thing we haven't gotten into today, and I don't know how much time we have left, is Pakistan, and that's been a huge issue in the news the last few months. It's something I've been worried about a long time. I'm sure you have as well. We got the elections coming up on February 18th. Musharraf, he's in Europe right now. He's heading to Davos. He's going to give a panel talk this week. He's got it was surprising to me that he's comfortable leaving his country. There might be a coup while he's gone. He might not have a seat when he comes back to Pakistan.
Well, I mean, I would. I mean, the military does seem to be loyal to him. That's the big question, right? Does he have full control over the military, or doesn't he? It's not entirely clear. You wonder whether there are elements that are outside of his control, or maybe there are elements. These elements are actually acting under his orders. When you see all these things like what appears to be the Pakistani intelligence services assisting terrorists. So,
well, that's.
I guess there's not a lot of clarity on that.
Well, there was an interesting story, I don't know if you saw last week. Tim Johnson, who's a sort of an Asia correspondent from McClatchy.
Yeah, he runs, I think, the absolute best China blog, China
Yeah,
Rise.
it's
fantastic.
Great. It's a great blog.
We both steal a lot from his blog. I think I see you stealing stuff as well.
Yeah. I mean, he did a story about how Ashfaq Kayani, who's the new chief of staff for the army in Pakistan, he's been considered kind of a quietist. He's not a political guy, loyal to Musharraf, but he feels uncomfortable with the way the military has gotten involved in politics there. So what he did last week was he actually recalled a lot of military personnel that had been placed in civilian agencies. And it had been a big problem because they'd been sort of using their positions to expand the army's clout and also take a lot of kickbacks. So, if you're reading the tea leaves in Islamabad, that might be a signal that, Kayani is not necessarily always going to be Musharraf's man. Because that was a Musharraf initiative to put all these military types throughout the rest of the government. So that was pretty interesting. But, yeah, I mean, as far as like a coup goes, I think it's something that I've been watching closely. And I don't see it happening unless there's a scenario where the elections happen, Musharraf's party cheats and wins a majority, and then the PPP, which is Benazir Bhutto's party, she's dead, but it's her party, goes into the streets, and there are riots in the streets, and the army is forced to kill people to keep Musharraf in power. Then I think you might see the military say, all right, it's time for you to go.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think this is actually one of the interesting things about the presidential campaign. As prominent an issue as Pakistan is, no one has any good ideas about what to do about it.
They all have terrible ideas. I mean, you got the Democrats saying we're going to send in troops to the northwestern frontier.
Obama said he's going to send in American troops to Pakistan. Funnily, these guys seem to be far right of even Bush on Pakistan.
Well, because it's an obvious area where they can run to his right and not scare Democratic voters, I think. But it's really irresponsible because that news gets front page of newspapers in Pakistan, and Musharraf then goes and denounces them, and it really hurts, I think, the U.S. ability to quietly do things. There already are, I think, a few quiet U.S. bases in Pakistan. There's been a lot of those Predator drones strikes in Pakistan. They always get denied, but basically, stuff is going on already. The U.S. is, considering funding the Frontier Corps, which is the paramilitary forces along the border.
Which is a disgrace. I mean, those guys can't fight worth a damn.
Well, this is. I don't think it's really an issue about whether they can fight. The fact is, there's a lot of proud history. The Khyber rifles back in the old Rudyard Kipling kind of days, and I think the real question is, do they want to fight? Because these guys that they're supposed to be cracking down on, like Baytullah Masood is the guy who's been accused of masterminding the murder of Benazir Bhutto, and he's sort of the ringleader of the Pakistani Taliban in South Waziristan. These guys are kind of friendly with the Frontier Corps, and so a lot of times when you have, as you did last week, a couple attacks by the Pakistani Taliban on Frontier Corps bases, they just run away because they don't want to fight these guys.
No, I mean, I don't. The idea that you could somehow take the model in Ambar and translate that to to the northwest frontier. I don't really see how that's possible. I think you have a lot of really bad options, and I wish I could come here and say, oh, I've got some kind of solution for what you do here, but I certainly don't.
Well, I mean, I think that the obvious problem is that Pakistan, the government of Pakistan, the ISI, the army, they haven't really changed their basic strategic outlook. You know, after 9/11, Richard Armitage and Colin Powell went to, I think they sat the then ISI chief, I can't remember his name, down and basically said, like, either you get on board or we're going to mess some stuff up. I'm not sure if this is a family program or not. But basically, you know, Pakistan said, all right, you know, we will give up our support for the Taliban. We'll help you take out Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. And I think since then, they've slowly been, you know, going back to the bad old ways and looking for strategic depth against India. And they have an interest in supporting the Taliban because they want to see trouble in Afghanistan. They don't want India to come in and have a free hand in Afghanistan.
Well, it's actually interesting you would say that because, you know, the big question now seems to be, you know, to what extent should we continue U.S. military aid to Pakistan? And everyone seems to think, oh, well, these weapons aren't going to be used against, you know, the Taliban or any type of extremists.
No, I mean, there's a lot of
F-16s and such are to be used against India.
Right.
But I mean, I find that to be a fairly convincing argument. I'm not sure that there is a rationale for continuing, you know, the kind of military aid we've been sending. I think it would be foolish to cut off aid and military aid to Pakistan, but to actually be sending F-16s. But as you say, you know, if their primary concern is it's always been a strategic depth against India, then perhaps you provide them with further impetus for, you know, going after the extremists in these places if they feel assured that they can sort of mind their defenses, mind themselves in a war against India.
Well, I think basically the bottom line is Pakistan, they have to feel secure from India. So whether it's because they've got, you know, U.S. weapons coming in, or whether, and this right now, you know, the time probably isn't right, but or whether there's a real peace track going on over Kashmir with India. I think you know, taking Kashmir off the table and you know, settling the border issues with India and basically, you know, cutting a lasting peace agreement would take away this impulse in Pakistan to support jihadi groups in Kashmir.
Well, I think I find it highly unlikely that that's going to happen anytime in the near future. I mean,
you're probably right.
There would have to be a democratically elected government in Islamabad that was, you know, able to secure a deal like that or able to give away anything there. I mean, I
don't know. I mean, you'd be, you know, they'd be fought tooth and nail by the military in Pakistan, which has an interest in seeing the conflict going, you know, keep going. So, you know, maybe it's really, and that was the hope with Musharraf, is that, you know, some guy who's got the ear of the military will better be able to make a deal stick, but he just didn't. He just wasn't able to pull it off.
Yeah, no, that would be great. That would certainly, you know, be a major step forward because a lot of these groups operate there. But I think we're getting maybe we should wrap it up here. Getting the nod from our cameraman here. But
okay.
Blake, it's been a pleasure. This was,
good times.
I think a first for both of us. So hopefully they'll invite us back.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you look like. I kind of have a face for radio, so I'm hoping that doesn't cause any problems.
Well, hopefully I will get to watch this on the internet at some point here soon. But anyway, thanks very much for doing this, Blake. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Michael. Stay warm.
Yeah, likewise, buddy. Talk to you later.
Bye.